Well, good morning, Park. It's a joy to be here to share God's word with you. My name is Nathan Payne. I serve here as the location pastor here at Near North, and great to see each and every one of you looking out over this wonderful crowd. I want to welcome those of you guys who are watching online as well. Look forward to when you can join us in person. And it's a joy to be able to watch that video, personally for me and for my family, because we know Lauren and Annika, and I have to tell you, they're 14 years old. 14 years old. And frankly, I could just close the service and say, okay, let's follow Jesus and do what he tells us to do just like them, and we're good to go. But what a privilege to watch them live out the faith that Jesus has given them in him. And it challenges all of us. None of us have an excuse, right? So grateful to be able to celebrate and actually watch as God has ignited a movement, not just through their location at Forest Glen, but all through Park. And you guys are going to hear more stories about what God is up to through the work of ministering to kids in need. Well, this morning we're going to be in the book of Exodus in chapter 25. You can turn to page 65 on the blue Bible, in the blue Bibles in front of you if you don't have a Bible, or just turn on your phone or your device and we can get there. And as you're getting there, I want you to think about this question. How many of you have ever had someone incredibly famous, powerful, influential ask you if they could come and live with you? How many of you have ever had someone like that live in your space? I haven't had that happen to me, but it does make me think back to the time when I was working in healthcare about 20 years ago, and I was assigned to a patient, and this is at a hospital not too far from here. And when I walked in, there was something about this patient. Now, I saw the patient's name, but I didn't know really who they were. And what was unique was I was assigned very particularly, they only had me. So I didn't take care of anyone else, just this one person. And I knew that something was different about this person because of that, but I knew something was even more different about this person when I walked in the bathroom as I was looking at the landscape of the belongings, and there is a golden toothbrush. I was like, okay, this must be somebody not like I don't know who this is, or this is somebody that must got some money. And I ended up finding out that I was taking care of a billionaire, that I was in the presence of someone who had significant wealth and power and influence. I won't say this name so I don't have to violate HIPAA for those of y'all who are in healthcare. And I have to wonder, how would I have responded if he looked up at me from that bed and said, hey, Nathan, can I come live with you? Can I come live in your apartment? Or maybe if I could ask you, how would you have responded if he said, hey, can I come live with you? Can I come dwell with you? Well, this morning we're going to talk about the subject that God's presence is with us and God's presence is in us. We're in the book of Exodus. We have to be reminded of the context of that story, that just last week we heard how they received the covenant, the invitation from God himself into relationship with him. Now, if you would recall that when God did this, if you haven't heard that message, make sure you check it out from last week. But if you remember, what happened was God descended on a mountain in fire and fury, because that's just who he is, as he was going to invite them into relationship with himself. And he has given them the 10 commandments as a means of inviting them into the covenant relationship, that these are the ground rules. And as he's doing that, look what happens. Look at verse 16 and 18 in Exodus 19. I have it on the screen. It says, on the morning on the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. And then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now, Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. What we see happening is that God has rescued them, and then God is inviting them into relationship, but he shows up on the mountain in fire and fury and all his glory, and they were scared scared out of their minds that, as Pastor Steve talked about last week, when they saw him and who he was, that it was nothing less than what we could describe as like nuclear, where they felt like in his presence they were going to melt, deteriorate like a tissue in a bonfire. Not because God was angry, not because God was mad at them. He was going to invite them into relationship. It was because that's just who he is. And today, when we enter into the story, this same God who the fire and power on the mountain, who's rescued them and invited them into covenant with them, he is about to ask them and tell them that he wants to come and dwell with them. Let me pray before we jump in. God, we are thankful for this morning. Thank you for your word. Thank you for your truth. Would you use it to shape us, to change our hearts, our minds, that we would see you for who you are and recognize you for what you have done for us. Would you give us faith to trust in you, to believe you, and to follow you. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, look with me in Exodus 25. Look at verse 1 and 3 and what God is going to say to the people. He says this to Moses. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel that they may take from me a contribution. From every man or woman whose heart moves him, you shall receive the contribution for me, and let them make me a sanctuary." That's verse 8. "That I may dwell in their midst, exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle, then all of its furniture, so that you shall make it." That God is asking them to make a contribution to him because he wants to dwell in a thing called a tabernacle, a sanctuary, a holy place. And notice that he says, I want them to give as their heart moves them. It points to that principle that the Apostle Paul affirms when he's writing to a group of followers of Jesus in Corinth. The same thing in 2 Corinthians 9:7. Each one must give as he or she has decided in their heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Now, I know we just took the offering a few minutes ago, and maybe you gave this morning because you felt like you had to or were obligated, and maybe you gave grudgingly. If you can come up at the front at the end, Lisa will give you a refund. They'll give you your $2 back. I'm kidding, y'all. There ain't no refund. It's going to the kingdom. Kingdom work. But God is inviting them to contribute to something that he's wants them to make so he can dwell with them. And look what he's asking them to give. It says, this is the contribution that you shall receive from them. This is in verse 3-7. Gold, silver, and bronze, blue and purple and scarlet yarn and fine twined linen, goat's hair. Anybody got some extra goat's hair laying around? Tanned ram skins, goat skins, acacia wood, oil for the lamp, spices, goes on to onyx stones and other stones for the setting of the ephod and the breastpiece. And God is asking them to give from their hearts, but he's asking them to give all these things. And you got to ask yourself, if they were a people who were enslaved for 400 years, who were just released from slavery not more than a couple of months before, where would they have gotten all of those things to give to God? Did they have was there a gold mine that they found and a silver mine that they got a bunch of stuff from in the last 2 months? No, of course not. Look at Exodus 12:35, and it says this, the people of Israel, this is when they're on their way out from Egypt, when God has delivered them. The people of Israel, they asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. That God was asking them to give things that he had provided for them. And I just have to tell you this morning that when God is asking you to give something to him, it's something that he's already given to you, that he already owns. That's just a side note. Look at what he's asking them to give to. He says in verse 8, chapter 25, verse 8, he says something that's amazing. And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. Make me a sanctuary, a holy place that I may dwell in their midst. God is saying that he will dwell with his people. Now, why would this be shocking? Why would this be something that's like a statement that's just perplexing? And why would this be something that would change the way in which they saw who God was? Well, we have to remember, but in the context of the greater story in Genesis chapter 1, when God has created all of humanity, that he's created us and he created all that there is and put the man and woman in the Garden of Eden, where there was no distance between God, where the presence of God was accessible, where relationships were full and free, where there was no distance, there was no pain, no suffering, no anxiety, no worry. That everything could be summarized in his statement in Genesis 1:31, that it was very good, that God's presence was there unhindered. And a relationship with him was at the center of everything good, everything delightful in the garden. The presence of God. And yet what happens? We find as we read that story in Genesis in chapter 3 that humanity decides that no, we want to be God. The presence of God isn't enough. We want to be God and become the center of the universe. And what happens then is that the brokenness enters into the world. That no longer can there be access to the presence of God, and broken relationships take place. Look at Genesis 3:23 and 24, what happens when they choose to go their own way. It says, therefore, the Lord God sent him, in referencing all of humanity, Adam and Eve, out of the Garden of Eden. He drove out the human beings, Adam and Eve, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim, which are two angels, and a flaming sword, so that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. That now Adam and Eve and humanity would have to live life outside of the garden, outside of the presence of God, where anxiety and oppression and brokenness and death and decay set in. That apart from the presence of God, that's what the reality would be. And ever since that brokenness has entered into the scope of humanity, we have been doing everything in our power to try to get back to the garden. I mean, think about it. When we talk about some of the tragedies that happen in our time and our place, like just last night and this weekend with what took place in Dayton and El Paso, every single one of us, there's something that stirs in our hearts that says, this is not the way that things were meant to be. We don't have to look far. We don't have to look to El Paso or Dayton. We can just look in the streets of Chicago as we walk up and down. If we really have our eyes open to see the things that are taking place in the lives of people and the brokenness and the pain. Maybe it's in the context of our neighbors when we talk with them about what's going on in their marriage and their family. When we talk with our cubicle mate and we hear about the anxiety, guilt-ridden life in which they're living. Or maybe it's our own stuff that we're carrying ourselves, that we are outside of the garden because we have been separated from the presence of God because of our sin. And we long for something that only the presence of God can fulfill. And look what God says again in verse 8. Let me read that again. He says, and let them make me a sanctuary, notice, that I may dwell in their midst. That God is going to come dwell with his people. When we've been separated from his presence, God, the holy and powerful one who was fire on the mountain, is going to come and dwell with them. And he instructs them to build a tabernacle. And it's like he's going to have them build this tabernacle. It's an elaborate tent that he's going to move in because he's invited them into relationship, almost like a marriage. And he gives them a covenant and the 10 commandments. And he's like, look, it's time for me to move in. And tabernacle literally means dwelling place. And the materials are very particular. The instructions for how to construct it are very exact because they point to something greater and to someone greater who's going to dwell there. It reminds me of in the fall a number of years ago, shortly before I was getting ready to come on staff at Park, and I was going on a camping trip, a camping weekend, and there were going to be a number of guys from Park who would be there, but I wasn't yet a pastor here. And so, y'all, I got to be honest this morning, brothers, we don't do a lot of camping. But I got a tent from Target, and I show up at this camp because I'm like, there's some manly men there. They have all their tents set up. The one dude had a stove that you could cook lasagna in. I'm like, man, I ain't never seen that before. Okay. And so I got to put my tent together. And so I'm taking out, I look at the instructions. It says, do this, do this, do this. So I'm like, okay, I got this, So all the guys, it's just their tents are already set up and they're watching me try to put this tent together. I pull out this stick that I'm like, what's that? Where's that go? And I'm doing the fumbling around. My tent's going all over the place. It's not going up. And what do? They come over and they gently say, brother, you don't know what you're doing. They look at the instructions and then they put my tent together because they followed the instructions exactly. And I'm grateful that I can call them friends, even though they made fun of me that day. You see, the tabernacle required very specific instructions in how God wanted it to be made. And we won't have time to go into all the details for the sake of time, but one thing I want you guys to pay attention to is in verse 10 where God says, I want you to make an ark of acacia wood. Now, the ark was essentially an ornate box, which would be the center focal point of the tabernacle. It said located at the back. As you can see, there's one curtain with a priest standing there, and then there's a second curtain on the inside, and that curtain on the inside was in front of what's called the most holy place, and inside there is the Ark of the Covenant. And notice that inside the ark that it's going to be overlaid with gold. It's going to contain the 10 commandments, the covenant that they were going into with God. And it was the only item that will be kept in that most holy place. And it would be behind a veil so no one would see it. And it was so incredibly holy that no one could touch it. And so there were golden poles that were through rings that would lift it up so they would never touch it. And it was only seen once a year by one person, the high priest, who would go in one time a year to see it. Notice the detail about the ark, verse 17 and 21. It says, you shall make a mercy seat to cover the ark of pure gold, and you shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark. That covering on top of the ark made of pure gold. And we call it the mercy seat, but when many of us think of mercy seat, we think of a seat like you're sitting in now. Oh, something to sit on. No, it wasn't something to sit on. It actually in the Hebrew is the word kaparet, which is more like a footstool where a king would rest his feet. And thinking of the word kaparet with the root word of the verb kippur, with you have a Jewish background, you think of, oh, I've heard that word. It sounds like Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. That idea of reconciliation, of enemies being made and brought back into reconciliation where the distance has been broken, hostilities have been ceased, where two parties at odds are no longer at odds, but are now in unity. And this was what was to cover the ark. And notice what God says about this mercy seat, his footstool. That veil behind the curtain, he says this, that there I will meet with you in verse 22, and from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony, I will speak with you about all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel. See, the mercy seat was going to be the very place in which the presence of a holy, incomparably powerful God would make himself known and meet with his people. Reminds me, talking of the ark, back in the 80s, any of you all who are older like I am, in the 80s, there's a movie series called Indiana Jones. And one of the series was called Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it was a movie, a fictitious movie. The account was that the plot was that the Nazis were trying to find the Ark of the Covenant because they wanted to use it and try to exert its power and manipulate the power behind the Ark so they could do what they wanted to do. And while that was a fictitious account, what is not fictitious is that the ark was where the presence and power of God was going to manifest itself to his people. There are so many other things that we could jump into and talk about as we talk about the ark. So many things that pointed to a greater reality, but we don't have time to do that today. All we can say is that each aspect of the ark pointed to something of the garden where there was fellowship and relationship with God, and that ultimately the ark itself pointed to something even greater. Well, in 2019, on an August morning, I think for many of us, we might look at and read this story about the ark and say, that really doesn't seem like it has anything to do with today. It seems quite archaic. But I want to ask you this. Do we actually this morning, have we wrestled with the question, is it even possible for God's presence to dwell with us? Is it possible for us to start to make our way back to the garden? For many of us, the way in which we approach the presence of God is we're like when I worked as a nurse and I worked in surgery. And so it was like when you go into the operating room, you had to first wash your hands. You had to have on a gown and a mask and a hat to cover your hair. And then you go to this thing at a sink and you'd have these little brushes. And I had to wash every single crevice of my fingers all around each finger, each hand, everything on my wrist, then my arms. And I'd have to do the other arm, and then I'd have to put on a pair of sterile gloves so that I wouldn't be contaminated. And if at any point during that time, if I touched anything or someone touched me, I'd have to start all the way over before I could go in that operating room. And many of us, we approach the presence of God in that same way. If we could just scrub a little bit better, if we could just get a little bit better, then we can be in the presence of God. What's the problem with that? You can never scrub enough. And it's exhausting. Maybe for others of us, we approach the presence of God like this. How many of you all are Cheetos eaters? We got some Cheetos eaters? Come on, raise your hand. Don't be ashamed if you eat Cheetos. We can see your lips. We know you eat Cheetos. Now, those of us who are Cheetos eaters, there's a couple ways to eat Cheetos. First, you open the bag, and then you could be the person that eats a Cheeto. You got cheese on your hand, and what do? You lick your fingers. Yeah, we know it's nasty, but it's so good, you know. But then there's some of us who are Cheetos eaters where we eat the whole bag and we do not do anything with our hands. We got like a mound of 6 inches of cheese dust on our hand. We wait for it. Then after it's over, we eat all the cheese dust all over our face and our hair. And some of us, in relation to how we think about the presence of God, it's like we got cheese dust all over our hands or our hair, and we just walk up in the presence of God like it's nothing. Like we're walking in the OR, the operating room, with cheese all over us. Both of them are misses. Trying to scrub too much and pretending like it doesn't matter. Maybe we have the mindset, I'm just not good enough. Or we have the mentality, I'm just going to work a little bit harder to become a better version of me, and then I can get in the presence of God. Or maybe some of us have the attitude that, man, God is lucky to have me. What up, G? Or I am a God. You should be grateful that you can be in my presence. Now, none of us would actually say that out loud. But in our hearts, many of us actually believe it. Thankfully, we're not left on our own to try to figure out our way into the presence of God. And matter of fact, as we look in John chapter 1, I want us to see something that's just incredible. That God has said that he's going to come dwell with his people in the tabernacle. But look what he says, and look what happens in John chapter 1, verse 1 and 14. It says, in the beginning was the Word. This is Jesus. And the Word, who is Jesus, was with God. And the Word, Jesus, was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus, who literally it says that he dwells with us. That means the Word literally is tabernacled with us. He makes his home with us. Emmanuel, God with us, that he comes to live among us. The great and mighty one who is the fire on the mountain comes to dwell with us. Look at what's said of Jesus It says in John 13, verse 4 and 5, that Jesus, he is with his disciples. He lays aside his outer garments and he takes a towel, he ties it around his waist, and he pours water into a basin and begins to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. See, Jesus, who was the one who stood, whose feet rested on the mercy seat, who we couldn't touch, whose presence we would not have been able to go into, that could only be entered by the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement. This same Jesus comes and washes the feet of his disciples to make them clean. It's Jesus is the one who makes us clean. We know that as we look in the book of Hebrews, chapter 9 and 10, for Christ has entered into heaven itself now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf, that Jesus has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain. Now, if you look back at that slide at the tabernacle, we're reminded that there was a number of curtains that you could not go past. This is the courtyard, and you can see there's a sacrificial altar that's right there in the very front where they would sacrifice for the sins of others. And then in the actual tabernacle, the Holy of Holies was the first section that only the priest could go in. And then the latter section where there's the Ark of the Covenant, only one time a year could the high priest go in and apply blood to cover the sins of the people. And it says that Jesus, he made the way through. Look at Matthew 27:51. It says, and behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split when Jesus died on the cross, when he took on our sins. It was as if he had ripped that curtain in half, that now, because of what Jesus has done, we now have access to the presence of God, that there's no longer a veil, a barrier, because of what Jesus has done for us. Now, Jesus, going on in John chapter 13, says this, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet, for I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done to you. So Jesus is the one that makes us clean, that washes us of our sins through his sacrifice for us, that gives us access to God. But he doesn't just make us clean. He also demonstrates a life that touched those who were considered unclean, that he was the one who went to the despised, the weak, those who were outcasts. I mean, think about this. Jesus, who literally was untouchable because of his power, his might, his glory, as his feet rested on the mercy seat, that if you touched the Ark of the Covenant, you would literally die. Jesus comes and dwelled in humility and flesh, comes and he puts his hands on those who are cast aside, those who would be considered untouchable. The untouchable one comes and touches the so-called untouchables. And I have to ask us this morning, Park, with all of our resources and all of our capabilities and all that God has entrusted to us, if Jesus was willing to go to those who were cast aside, who are we unwilling to serve and touch? Who are the people groups that in our hearts we say, I will not serve them? Is it because of their culture? Is it because of their politics? Is it because of their education, their economics that we are unwilling to? Is it because of what they posted on Facebook that we're unwilling to serve them? Whose feet are we unwilling to wash? I think about when I served as a nurse in the ICU, and I remember one patient when I walked in the door. I remember this patient calling me the N-word. And I was assigned to care for him, and I remember just the the insult, the sort of just that sense of just a lack of dignity that he had for me, regard for me as a person created in the image of God. And then I was assigned to him the next day. And I remember walking into the door and he said, "Hello, fill in the blank." But this time he was sitting in his own waste. And I remember as I thought about what he had been calling me and how he had just treated me as if I was someone to be disregarded. And then what was it that God was asking me to do? And I remember getting my cleaning supplies and taking care of him and giving him dignity. And the thing is, y'all, was it because I was a nice guy? No. Was it because I'm just a good person and just that kind of a guy? No, it was because the same God who had loved me and picked me up out of the ash heap and washed me off, how could I not do the same? Whose feet are we unwilling to wash? God, in the person of Jesus, comes and dwells with us, but it gets even better. Look at Acts chapter 2, verse 1. It says, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. It's a gathering of followers of Jesus who had watched him been sacrificed on the cross. They watched as he had been raised from the dead, and they were gathered 50 days after Passover, which for our Jewish friends, they would remember that it was the feast of Shavuot, which Shavuot is this. It's actually the commemoration of God descending on the mountain, giving his testimony or the covenant and inviting them into relationship. They would have recalled, as many of those folks in that time and would have gathered at the temple as they thought and remembered that God invited them into relationship. They would have been reminded that God had said, I'm going to come and dwell with you in the tabernacle. Now, what happens to this particular group of followers of Jesus? Look at verse 2-3. It says, suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. These followers of Jesus, God himself now is going to dwell in them. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 16 says, for we, the people of God, are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. That we as a biblical community of followers of Jesus are the temple of the living God. That we're not simply gathering here on Sundays to have a service and sing songs and maybe hear a good talk. That when we gather together, the presence of God is here. And the power of his Spirit is here. And that's something that you can't get going to a concert. You can't get this going to Lollapalooza. You can't get this going to a Cubs game. You cannot get that because it is the power of God and the presence of his Spirit, God's presence dwelling with us when we are gathered together as a people. But he goes even further to 1 Corinthians 6:19. I want you to hear this. And do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own. That our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit, that the God, the power on the mountain in all of his glory chooses to come and dwell us. He doesn't just dwell among us, he dwells in us for those of us who have trusted in Jesus. And yet for many of us, I wonder if we're like me when I was in that hospital room, that I was in the presence of someone great and I didn't even know it. That we, because of his Spirit indwelling us, because his Spirit dwells in us, that we don't have to be wrecked by fear and anxiety and worry. That we can have the confidence to use our gifts that he's entrusted us, that we don't have to be afraid to step out, to share his love, to show his light to those that he's placed in our lives. See, the power on the mountain is with us and in us. And maybe this morning, Today, you've not yet trusted in what Jesus has done for you, that he has made a way for you to enter into and have access to the presence of God. And I just have to tell you that it would be our joy, it would be our plea that this morning would be the morning that you would entrust yourself to Jesus for what he has done for you and receive what he has done that you cannot do for yourself. Park, if the presence of God is in us and among us, this neighborhood, this region, our city cannot be the same, because when God shows up, things get put back in order. Amen. So I want to challenge us this morning. I want you to answer that question one more time. I want to ask you that question, rather. See, God's presence is with us. God's presence is in us. So have you ever had a powerful, influential person asked to come live with you? The answer is yes, and he's here. Let's pray. God, we are so grateful to you because you have, in the person of Jesus, revealed your love for us and giving him on our behalf. God, thank you that you, the mighty and holy one, who we could not approach apart from your grace, we thank you that you have pursued us, that you have initiated relationship, that you have come to dwell with us. And for those of us who have received you, Jesus, thank you that your Spirit dwells in us. May we be transformed as a result. May our church be transformed as a result. May our neighborhood, this region on the near north side, and our city itself be transformed as a result of your Spirit inhabiting us. Do it for your glory and for your fame. In Jesus' name, amen.